Boyd. He's coming to us today from Red Trident. So prior to joining Red Trident, Aaron was with organizations such as Dragos, Honeywell, and DCP Midstream, where he leveraged his extensive experience in conducting penetration testing, threat hunting, and vulnerability assessment within complex OT, ICS, IT infrastructures, and applications, as well as integrating security solutions to strengthen environments and enhance cybersecurity programs. And today he'll be sharing with us quick wins to securing your architecture. Aaron?
Awesome, appreciate it. I certainly appreciate y'all coming to hang out with me, especially after lunch and choosing to sit in here versus all the other awesome talks. So like what was said, my name is Aaron Boyd. My official job title is Senior OT Cybersecurity Specialist for a company called Red Trident. Got a pretty diverse background, but basically I make a living breaking into systems and securing systems. So started out 2003 as a hobbyist. As a kid, you tell me no, I'm gonna do it anyway. Still the same way as an adult. So I don't like talking about myself, so we're just gonna get into the content. So I'll just start off with the agenda. I wanna highlight this fact: there is no such thing as a dumb question. Because as we do these assessments, I'm not here to point the finger or judge. I'm here to help raise awareness and educate. So we're gonna be talking a little bit in particular about Active Directory workstations and configurations. Why? Because it's in every single environment out there, just about. It's hard to enter an OT or IT environment without those things. So as we do talks like this, and we pick on Active Directory a lot because it has a pretty significantly large attack surface, but I also like to cover some of the benefits to remind people why we're using this in the first place. And then also some of the common oversights that get abused by malicious actors out there. So Active Directory has up to 50 or more different things that can be abused. I just like to cover these things that I see almost every time. So the things in particular, talking about domain trusts. So we might know what trust means, but we might not know that there's different types of trusts and how those can be impacted, how they're configured and their purposes, exactly how domain administrators are being managed in an environment. So obviously IT pen test, the number one goal is to get domain admin. So I've been doing this for 20 years. I can confidently say there's only 2 pen tests I've done where we did not get domain admin by the end of that engagement. So pretty easy to do if you know what you're doing. Common observations in relation to workstation management, particularly around how those local administrators are being managed, even the ones not connected to a domain. So talking about those local administrator credentials and also vendor default credentials. This is more of a narrative versus slides of content, because it's hard to talk about this without throwing vendors under the bus, which I don't want to do, knowing the session's being recorded. And I'm also going to be sharing these slides on the Red Trident website as well, so you can always feel free to download them later. And all that good stuff. And I talk fast because I like to leave a lot of room for Q&A because I cover a lot of content. So feel free to ask whatever you'd like. So just a quick reminder on some of the benefits. So obviously the number one thing, security really. So it helps you improve security by controlling access to network resources from a centralized location. I don't know if any of you have had the burden of jumping from machine to machine, configuring things, joining them to work groups and whatnot, but having a domain simplifies that where you don't have to do it all individually. You could do it all from a central location. Second point, extensibility. So the organizational capabilities within domain architecture. So think organizational unit structure, group policy objects, et cetera, gives you a chance to name schemas and name your domain trees in a specific way so it's easy to know what you're looking at as you make changes over time. And then simplicity, so being able to manage the user identities and access privileges across the enterprise. So if you have a certain group for help desk, for example, they need the ability to reset or user passwords and unlock accounts. You don't have to grant that to everybody. You want to limit that as much as possible. So you can do that through a simple AD group, for example, and that's just one example of many different things. So jumping into oversights that can be abused by malicious actors, like I had mentioned, that first thing being domain trusts. So there's a lot more different domain trusts and types like this, especially when we start talking about Microsoft Azure, which is here and it's coming, especially in the OT world. Ignore anyone that says there is no cloud in OT, there is. So one of the most common, not even common anymore, but ones that are always alarming to me are external trusts. So external trusts are those non-transitive trusts between a domain in one forest and another domain in another forest. So think of it like a managed service provider might have a domain on their side, they manage security for your organization, you have a completely separate domain. Do you have an external trust between those two domains? Granted, that could also be a forest trust depending on how you're set it up, but the reason external trust should stick out a little bit more if that's how it's set up is because that trust actually uses NTLM version 1 for authentication, for anyone that remembers. or knows about any of the exploits commonly leveraged there. Next one is forest trusts. So when you think of a forest, you got many different trees, so Active Directory forests and trees. And this is a transitive trust between two forests that allow users in any one domain in one forest to be authenticated in any domains in another forest. So that's another common thing we see with managed system providers. It's also common in ICS/OT, especially on the topic of mergers and acquisitions. So former life DCP Midstream, we would buy and acquire companies. We'd also sell some assets to other companies, different domains. And the quickest way to roll over those things is to set up a domain trust. So that way, users authenticating in one thing can still authenticate and access resources in the other domain. But a lot of times we're human, we forget things. We set up that trust during the merger and acquisition process. We forget to go back in and turn it off. So that's another thing that gets abused quite a bit. And then next thing about domain trust is you have some directional capabilities. And this is the one I find gets overlooked the most because a lot of assessments will ask, do you have domain trusts? If yes, I would always ask, what direction? Like, what do you mean, what direction? We just know we have a trust. So a little bit of education and awareness here on the direction of trusts. So an incoming domain trust basically means that users in this domain, meaning your company domain, can be authenticated in a specified domain, realm, or forest. So in the OT world, say you have a domain unique for each region or each plant, and you need to access those using your corporate resources. We've seen those trusts set up in that way where the plant will trust the credentials of those coming from corporate. We tend to hopefully never see that, but sadly we do. And then there's outgoing domain trusts where users in the specified domain, realm, or forest can be authenticated to this domain. So this is also another common observation seen in the MSSP and managed service world, particularly in the renewable industry. So when you think of renewables, you know, solar and wind farm, those tend to be centrally operated by operate and maintain companies. And because they're all operating from a central location and they're managing assets for other customers, we see these domain trusts where they're managing everything using their corporate domain, but the assets on their customer side sit on another domain. So really, I'd only need to compromise you. If I compromise you, I compromise every one of your customers. And depending on the direction of that domain, if they're bi-directional, which is probably the worst one, where any user in any domain can be trusted in any domain, depending on the relationship of that trust, where even if I compromise their customer, that subsequently impacts all their other customers, including them, because of that bi-directional trust. So talking about specific examples on how these things are exploited. So the key point on trust is parent domain and child domain exploitation. So scenario, assume you've got company.com or company.local is your parent domain, and you want to separate your domains where you have ICS specific or plant-based specific domains. So you might create a child domain off your parent domain where it would be, you know, plant.company.com or plant.company.net. The one thing a lot of people aren't aware about is when you actually create that child domain, it's automatically created as a two-way trust with the parent domain. There's no way to turn that off in Active Directory. After you turn that on, you actually have to go back in and turn that setting off. Why Microsoft did it, don't know. Microsoft is going to Microsoft. So essentially what this means is if you're domain admin on a child domain, that can lead to domain admin on the parent domain, and vice versa. Even if the enterprise is the ultimate target, if we land in that plant network and achieve domain admin, which like I was talking about is easy to do, we also own the corporate domain. I actually had this happen recently in a manufacturing customer where they were doing regionalized DMZ domains. They were a global dispersed organization, so the target was how far can we get, assuming we land in the DMZ, because a lot of companies put a lot of attention on securing that perimeter, that hardened shell, where we like to challenge the narrative like, great, eventually someone's going to get in somehow. Phishing continues to be the number one thing. Ransomware continues to be a number one thing. Humans are going to click links. It happens. So the question really shouldn't be, can they get in? The question should be, how far can they get when they get there? And that was a narrative that resonated really well with this customer. So they landed us in the manufacturing DMZ in South Central America. And basically by the end of day 2, we compromised the domain of their entire fleet because they had that bi-directional domain. And they weren't aware of that automatic two-way trust being established with those parent-child domains. So it was a huge learning opportunity for them. The second one, talking about, so one-way trust outbound, a common thing we use here is what's called RDP inception. So when you're accessing different assets from other locations, RDP tends to be the most common protocol. Makes sense, but a lot of things that customers overlook is exactly how are they hardening those RDP connections? Are you actually going in and making sure you're disabling drive redirection, clipboard, the ability to copy files in and out? If you're not turning that off, then we have an easy way to move files in and out of the environment over that RDP connection because that RDP connection is encrypted. So even if your firewall's, doing deep packet inspection on files traversing the wire, because that traffic is encrypted, there's a good chance your next generation firewall is not scanning the files. You're relying on whatever is installed on the systems on the destination, which remember in the OT world, there's a lot of things that you can't install on those machines because they're built by specification. So it's a common oversight. And then lastly is just security principles and access control lists. So the ability to change passwords, that's an access control list in Active Directory. Change password or write password, et cetera, where we target those attributes. A common tool to identify all these things is called Bloodhound. So if anyone's ever run Bloodhound, look at the output. You see the nice lines and the arrows indicating the direction of that access control list. That tells you what those permissions are. And being able to add people to groups on foreign domains. So every object in Active Directory, whether it's a user, a computer, a server, or a group, has a unique security identifier. So it's not hard to identify what those security ID numbers are and just add that number to the member of permission on the other user. And that's how you ultimately become domain admin on domain A when you're a domain admin on domain B. You just need the security identifier of the domain admins group on domain A, add that to your account on domain B, and you've got it. Because really the first thing a lot of malicious actors do, surprisingly, is use Bloodhound, despite how noisy it is. But we use it on Pentest too, because we're limited to our time. Malicious actors are not bound to the same limit or scope or rules of engagement like we are, so we need to be efficient. So we use tools to collect as much information as possible to identify these misconfigurations to abuse them. So the biggest recommendation I have when it comes to domain trusts is just don't use them. I know this is alarming, especially talking from an overhead perspective, but trust me, you will thank yourselves later when you don't get ransomware to learn that your customer being impacted can also impact you, depending on what your operational model looks like. So the next one is talking about domain administrators. So pretty self-explanatory why these are targets. If you're a domain admin, you could do whatever you want on that domain. So some of the things we commonly see with these domain administrators is there are actually service accounts with domain administrator privileges, which a lot of vendors say you need domain admin to function. I have yet to see an actual product or vendor actually require this level of permission. This falls in line with the trust but verify narrative that we always like to hear a lot. So always make sure you're not giving overly excessive privileges to service accounts because I can almost guarantee you they don't need it. Second point is standard user accounts being used. So when I say standard user accounts, think of the user account you're using to log in every day. So anyone designated system administrator in your environment that might have domain admin privileges, very rarely do we see them get provisioned an additional account to have that domain administrator functionality. So every day they're logging in, they're using domain admin privileges, even though it's not being used to manage the domain. Third point is the default admin being enabled. So this one is always a tough one to raise awareness on. So a lot of those public tools and scripts out there, because a lot of malicious actors just take what's available off the internet. A lot of these tools just look for the hard-coded name administrator because that's what's turned on by default out of the box. So doing something as simple as just renaming or disabling that account, because you probably don't need that anymore, once the domain or domain controllers have been stood up, can thwart a lot of those tools. And probably the one I like to talk about most that I don't see brought up very often is the lack of visibility when these accounts are used. So I'm not going to ask anyone to raise their hands because I'm not trying to out anybody, but just ask yourselves, do you actually know when your domain admin accounts are being used? Very rarely has that answer ever been yes. And really the question is, should they be used? So the recommendations here is create domain admin specific accounts for those users. Those service accounts don't need those domain administrator privileges, no standard accounts. At Red Trident, I've got probably 11 different accounts for 11 different functions, all protected with MFA, privileged identity management, et cetera, depending what you're doing. Is it a burden? Sometimes, but it's hard for me to say I practice security if I'm not chewing my own dog food. And automatically rotate those passwords. There's a lot of third-party tools out there to do that. Think like your CyberArk, your BeyondTrust, et cetera, where those passwords are automatically being rotated either every 30 days, 60 days, whatever your threat profile is. I've been aggressive enough in a former life where that password was rotated every time we checked it out. So even though the credentials were cached on a machine, the password would never be the same the following day. And lastly, alert and monitor the usage of when those accounts are being used. Which kind of blends into this next point is restricting interactive logon capabilities. This is another one I see with service accounts even when they're not domain admin. So when you see interactive logon, envision it like the Control-Alt-Delete screen before you log in, where you enter username and password to load your desktop environment. Service accounts have this capability for whatever reason, I will never know. Most service accounts just do something as simple as a WMI query or a PowerShell query or an SSH query. They do not need logon interactive capabilities. The reason why you want to turn that off is there actually are some pretty lax threat actors out there that actually log in using those accounts via RDP. And why are those accounts targeted? Because the passwords never change. So if they're able to log in with this account, then they can likely use it to laterally move to whatever endpoint they want, whatever it can log into, because it's not being restricted at those levels. And then also, domain admin accounts really shouldn't be used for non-domain admin purposes. So in Active Directory, if you're envisioning it, think of the logon tab under the account tab, where you can actually specify what machines that account can be used to log on to. For example, our domain admin accounts in a former life couldn't be used to log into anything other than the domain controllers, because why would I need to log on as a domain admin on a workstation? And then disable and rename that default administrator account, because like I had mentioned, it's probably not needed once your domain has been built. And even if you do need it, like you need that break glass moment, renaming it easily disables those capabilities of those default tools off the shelf that just look for the administrator account. The other thing when we're talking visibility is think of net user commands. So you know, net user, administrator, whatnot. You know in your environment, hey, we rename these accounts. So think of your SOC and your visibility. If someone's looking to see if the administrator account's enabled, you know you rename that account. So that's something that sticks out to look into. And automatically rotate the passwords if you actually do need that account. So now on the topic of workstation management observations, so those local administrator accounts, even when they're not tied to a domain, pretty obvious also why we're targeting these accounts. They could do whatever they want on those workstations. So the common recommendations here is also renaming that account, similar to the same strategy with renaming the default administrator account on a domain admin level, where you're at least thwarting those public tools, exploits, scripts, etc. Automatically rotate those passwords. So Microsoft actually has a free tool to do this for local administrator accounts. It's called LAPS, Local Administrator Password Solution. And also pay attention if you do use this tool today or have plans to use it in the future. Look at the implementation of it, because this actually creates an access control list on the domain for what user or what group can read the LAPS passwords. We've actually done assessments where we've seen domain users can read LAPS passwords. So even though you're implementing LAPS to protect that local administrator account, any user on the domain can retrieve the password, which essentially means every user in that domain has local admin on every machine. Talking about role-based access control, like I had just mentioned, don't let all domain users know what these passwords are, have pretty strict role-based access controls implemented, where really only authorized users should be able to access those credentials, and retrieving them should also be configured for alerts and monitored. So every time you go to retrieve a password from LAPS, you should have an alert saying so-and-so will retrieve the password for this account to this machine. And when it happens, so you know that it's probably unlikely you've got somebody in your environment retrieving this at 4 o'clock in the morning if they're not on call. And then just the lack of visibility when used. So just always asking yourself, do you actually know when your local administrator accounts are being used? And if they are being used, should they be? So the vendor default credentials, so anyone that's bought a home router or home device, and even in industrial environments, so all devices ship with a standard set of credentials. You know, admin password, or even no password at all. I can't tell you how many times we've actually done assessments and the password is still the same as when it was sent out of the box. No matter the amount of network segmentation you put in place, eventually we will find this asset. As a pen tester, if I see a logon page and it gives me a version number, banner and phone number, I'm going to Google the public accessible documentation and say, hey, what's the password on this device? I don't need a brute force anymore. I don't need to crack it anymore. I can just try to log in with the default password. And for devices where you do change the password, there tends to be a common schema that you change things to, or that people change them to, where if I uncover one password, there's a good chance I'm going to try this on more than one thing. And if that password works on more than one thing, then that's a pretty big issue. You know, on this specific narrative, I'm always reminded of a locomotive pen test I did for a passenger rail company, and you know, after enumerating the locomotive we had access to, Found a few devices, wasn't sure what they were. Eventually I found out they were inclinometers. So they're devices on the locomotive that control the speed, whether it's going up a hill or down a hill. So think passenger rail carries people. This thing says if you're going up a hill, reduce speed to do it safely. If you're going down a hill, significantly reduce speed and increase traction so you don't fly off the rails. And this device had a logon page, and I found the vendor actually supported this for the customer. No default password documentation available on the internet, but the login page included a support contact number. So that support contact number indicated to me, all right, this is probably managed by a vendor. So I social engineered them within 10 minutes, got the password for the one device I found, even though there were multiple, and just looking at the password they gave me, and after logging in and confirming it, it's a common schema. It was just the 4-digit letter of that organization's acronym, followed by the last 4 numbers on the device serial number. So always keep that in mind on exactly, are your vendors actually supporting your passwords if they're managing your devices? Ask them the questions. Who's able to retrieve the passwords for support purposes? There was no verification whatsoever. They didn't ask me what company I worked for. I didn't try to do anything overly sophisticated. I just called them up and said, hey, I'm trying to troubleshoot some connectivity issues we're seeing on this device. This is the serial number. Can you help me out? They didn't verify anything, which was particularly concerning. And like I had mentioned, it was passenger rail. So had I been looking to cause some serious loss of life, there's a good chance I could have been able to do that. It's pretty much everything I had content-wise. I like to leave as much room for questions as possible. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic because we are recording this session. And feel free. Of course, former coworker raises his hand.
It's a pretty simple question. You said not to use domain trusts, and I definitely agree with you between IT and OT. My question is, what do you feel about using domain trusts between the OT control network and the OT DMZ?
I would still say a hard no, because again, we're trying to separate as much as possible. Even though you have separate domains to authenticate from domain A to point B. Remember that example I was giving, a lot of organizations are securing that candy shell coding. They're not focused on that GUI center, which again, the questions really shouldn't be, can they get in? It's how far can they be when they get there? And really, it's a lot of outside the box thinking. I know I tend to get challenged a lot when I talk about domain separation the way I do, but really it's a risk reward. How often are people really connecting from your DMZ and your plant? And I mean, I can't think of a reason why somebody would need to connect from a plant into a DMZ. So that's where you got those direction of trust to consider. What else? No such thing as a dumb question. I promise you I'm a gentle giant. I know my tallness might be intimidating people, but I assure you, I'm nice. Okay, well, if anyone has any questions after the event, or feel free to see me. Obviously, I stick out. Or if you just want to, feel free to reach out to me. My email's there. I refuse to call it X. My Twitter handle is there. And feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk.